Order, members. We'll recommence the sitting, and it is questions to the Minister for Justice. I call Peter Martin.
Mr. Speaker, question 1.
Minister.
The management of PSNI estate, including acquisitions, is entirely an operational matter for the Chief Constable, who is accountable to the Northern Ireland Policing Board. However, I will continue working with the Chief Constable, my executive colleagues and the Department of Finance to ensure we have a police service that is properly resourced in all aspects for the challenges it faces.
Mr. Martin.
I can thank the Minister for her answer. Can I ask her, given her department's recent allocation by the Executive of an additional £39.3 million, will police officers now get their pay award, and how long will it take to see much-needed additional PSNI officers on the ground to relieve the pressure serving officers are currently under?
Minister.
Well, I'm not sure quite how that relates to the estate strategy for the PSNI, but I'm happy to answer it nevertheless, Mr. Speaker. The recent additional funding of £39.3 million to my department includes £36.7 million, which has been allocated to the PSNI. The member will be aware the Chief Constable has welcomed that allocation, as it meets in full the amount of pressures identified by the PSNI to sustain policing in this financial year. It is now for the PSNI to bring forward a business case for that, but I have given my approval to the recommendations of the PRRB.
Minister, during COVID, the Department of Justice had to spend necessarily £4 million on a mass mortuary within Kinnegad. On the sale of Kinnegad, was there any clawback for the Department of Justice for that investment?
The investment in that particular piece of work is not something that would be clawed back from the sale of the site. That has already been dismantled. So the sale of the site, as you know, we were able to use the site at the behest of the MOD, and so there's no clawback involved.
Cathy Mason.
Concordia, question number 2, Lidhill.
My department is continuing to oversee a multi-agency programme of work to implement the Gillen Review recommendations. This includes progress against a range of recommendations intended to support child victims of serious sexual offences, including the ongoing delivery of a judge-led voluntary protocol to expedite serious sexual offence cases involving child witnesses under 13 years of age in Belfast and Antrim Crown Courts. Evaluation of the protocol cases in 2023 found there was a 70% reduction in the average time taken between reporting the crime and court disposal. The principles of the protocol have been extended to similar cases for children aged under 16 across all court areas. Sexual offence legal advisor services have been provided successfully, providing free legal advice and support to more than 2,000 adult complainants in serious sexual offence cases, and that will shortly be extended to child complainants. My officials have engaged stakeholders, including children and young people, to develop the Child Solace Scheme that will provide general and specific legal advice in relation to their case and ensure that their interests and wishes are communicated to the courts. Remote evidence centres have been established in Belfast and Craigavon to provide a safe, comfortable space away from the court building for vulnerable witnesses, including children, to give their best evidence by video link. So far this year, 317 witnesses, including 133 children, have attended or are scheduled to attend the REC to give evidence. All achieving best evidence interviews with child victims of sexual offences are now conducted by a specialist ABE cadre with expertise in this area. The Health Minister and I are also committed to considering the development of a Barnahus-style model for Northern Ireland to provide a multidisciplinary and rights-based response for child victims and witnesses of violence. My department also continues to provide funding to support services for child victims of sexual crime. It includes funding for Victim Support NI to deliver the Children and Young People's Independent Sexual Violence Advocate, or CHISVA service, and the NSPCC Young Witnesses Service, which supports young victims and witnesses called to give evidence. We also contribute funding to the Assist NI Advocacy Service, dedicated to providing support to all victims of domestic and sexual abuse.
Mrs Mason.
Concordia, and I thank the Minister for that really comprehensive answer. Minister, it's widely accepted that establishing, as you mentioned, their one child-friendly setting where they don't have to constantly repeat their story provides better support for child victims of sexual abuse. Can the Minister provide, and you did mention it, but could you maybe give us more of an overview of what your department's plans are to establish the Barnahus scheme, as we know it's been very successful in the south?
Minister.
Well, we are very committed to looking at the Barnahouse-style model for Northern Ireland. There is a successful model in Iceland, there's one in Scotland, and now there's one in the south, and I think it's something that we want to do. There's a joint working group completed some benchmarking of current relevant services against the Barnahouse quality standards, and that gained some useful information from several study visits they did. So the next stage is that we will use those findings to develop high-level options and commence analysis of costings.
Connie Egan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answers so far. Can I ask when we will see the full rollout of the Under-13 protocol?
Sir.
That will ultimately be a matter for the judiciary, and that it is a judicial-led protocol, but I think the fact it has now been extended to under-16s right across the board augurs well for us seeing that more widely extended. It's something certainly that we would support, but also importantly there are other ways that we can assist child victims, particularly those younger child victims. There is some work that we intend to do, as I said, with Child Solace and also extending the REC programme, but there are other pieces of work that we're committed to taking forward, including, for example, a trial of pre-recorded witness statements and evidence.
Paul Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answers thus far. In a recent reply to a written question, the Minister admitted that her department does not keep records of those young people who have received support after their case is concluded. Will the Minister commit to changing this so that information is captured to enable us to better understand the whole process for young victims and witnesses? Thank you.
Well, it would not be for the Department of Justice to maintain a record of people once they've exited the justice system, which is the last point of contact for which we are responsible. They would then pass on to services that are provided by the Department of Health. And so it's important that we recognise that once people have gone through the justice system and completed that journey, that they then move on into those other services. But it is something that I would be happy to raise with the Department of Health.
Matthew O'Toole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, in an written answer to me, you said that you were committed to proceeding with reform of the reasonable belief defence in rape cases as per the Gillen Review. Can you be specific that the reform you're looking at will include a reform that will a change which will reform the way a jury can ascertain in a court proceeding how and whether the defendant specifically sought consent?
Minister.
This is an issue that I am hoping to address through this mandate, but it is a sensitive and complex legal issue, and it's one on which we will need to take significant advice. However, it is something that I think in the last bill that we intend to bring forward is something that we would be keen to consider.
Honourable Murray.
Mr. Speaker, question number 3.
Sure.
I was pleased to present 5 innovative and transformative bids from my department to the Interim Public Sector Transformation Board. Following consideration by the Interim Board, I welcome the fact that 3 of those bids have moved forward for further consideration. The bids relate to 3 key areas, namely speeding up and transforming the criminal justice system, reducing reoffending and prison population initiatives, and electronic monitoring for those on bail or on licence. All 3 of these bids present innovative and transformative solutions to some of the challenges currently facing the justice system. While the timescale for notifying the outcome of the Stage 2 assessment has not been confirmed yet, I understand that the Interim Board will provide advice to the Finance Minister and recommendations will then be made to Executive, and I look forward to the consideration of the recommendations at Executive.
Mr. McMurray.
Can the Minister provide further detail on the 3 bids that have been selected for further consideration?
Minister.
Yes, I'm very pleased to provide some insight into the bids which have made it through for further consideration by the Interim Board. We made a bid which has been supported by the Criminal Justice Board to speed up transformation and transform the criminal justice system. This bid is in partnership with the Public Prosecution Service and will, amongst other things, reduce demand through providing a proportionate response to offending, including increasing non-court disposals, and make investments in early engagement across the justice system, including between police and prosecution and defence, to maximise efficiencies. The bid will also seek to utilise and exploit technology to support transformation. We have a bid which involves the Department for Communities to reduce reoffending alongside measures to address the prison population. It includes provision for investments in a bail support scheme to divert people from custody, the rollout of enhanced combination orders through Probation Board, and as an alternative to short prison sentences, and a review of the prison service framework for delivering rehabilitation. Finally, we have a bid to create a multidisciplinary team to examine the technical and policy implications of implementing GPS location monitoring for those on bail or licence fitted with an electronic tag as part of their release conditions. All 3 present innovative and transformative solutions to the challenges facing the justice system. And I'm wholly convinced should we receive funding through these bids, it will afford us with opportunities to improve the effectiveness and efficiency and to meet the increased and changing demands on a system, providing stability for the future.
Minister.
I share the Chief, with respect, Mr Speaker, I would like to take questions 4 and 8 together. I share the Chief Constable's ambition to increase police officer numbers. However, the reality is that police officer numbers cannot increase without additional funding, which I have been actively working to secure through the appropriate channels. My officials have also been working closely and constructively with the Chief Constable and his team to support the PSNI on the development of a plan to recover police officer numbers to enable the case to be made to the Department of Finance for additional funding. I acknowledge the Chief Constable has expressed disappointment that the draft programme for government does not adequately reflect the issues facing policing here and wants to see those commitments strengthened. I can assure you that I will continue to support the Chief Constable where I can while respecting his operational independence.
Mark Durgan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the Minister for her answer. The Minister has often asserted her respect for the Chief Constable's operational independence. And I'm glad to hear her provide her support for his operational ambitions. Can the Minister tell us how she will put forward the argument to her executive colleagues around the importance of funding the police to allow them to grow the numbers to those aspired to by the Chief Constable?
Minister.
Well, this is not, in the first instance, about the numbers aspired to by the Chief Constable. There is a separate work stream that we are undertaking in parallel with stabilisation processes to identify what the right size of police service should be. And that's a piece of work where we'll be working with the Chief Constable and with others. However, the issue is about what we can do within this mandate, and we have only 3 years left. There is only limited capacity in the training school, and therefore what we are trying to do is add roughly 150 officers to the PSNI each year. The funding for that will come through a business case where we will set out the cost to society if we do not achieve that objective. That would take us up to just shy of the 7,000 officers that has been the target figure that we have agreed for this phase. But it will require support of executive colleagues and the Minister of Finance to be able to get that business case through.
Ms McLaughlin isn't in her place. I call Peter McReynolds.
I thank the Minister for her answers so far. Minister, if the allocation of funding for policing falls short of that required to facilitate further recruitment, what additional work will you do with the Chief Constable on the stabilisation of policing?
I think one of the key things in terms of stabilisation is to ensure that we stave off the attrition and the loss of officers to other parts of these islands. And so I think the recent allocation, which has allowed us first and foremost to allow the PSNI to clear what was left of their pressures, in-year pressures, will put us in a position where we will then be able, as I have already done, indicate my support for the PRRB recommendations with regard to pay. I think that's important. If we don't pay our officers, they will go elsewhere to jobs that are perhaps more straightforward and less stressful. So that is the first stage in the stabilisation process. The second, as I said, is to look to get money for the business case so that we can deliver more officers into the service. And I believe that the executive have expressed, certainly the executive parties have expressed their desire to see that happen. And so I'm confident that that will be taken seriously as a bid going forward. And the third strand is to look at what shape the police service should take in the years ahead in terms of overall numbers. And I know that from the report that the Chief Constable himself had commissioned, they reckoned somewhere between 6.9 and 7.2 was about the right number. So we're now looking to see how we can get that and maintain it going forward.
Danny Donnelly.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for her answers so far. Question 5, please.
Minister.
I'm committed to ensuring that the risk posed to victims of domestic abuse is assessed and managed as effectively as possible. Members will be aware the Leonard Consultancy conducted an independent review of the Multi-Agency Risk Assessment Conference (MARAC) arrangements on behalf of all strategic partners involved. The review examined MARAC's operational effectiveness and identified potential learning and opportunities for improved effectiveness. My department has now established a dedicated multi-agency working group to consider and respond to the findings of this review with a view to strengthening the response and protections for victims of domestic abuse. The group's key objectives are to identify costed recommendations for a new multi-agency risk assessment arrangement and supporting processes, to improve risk assessment and management in order to increase the safety of victims of domestic abuse and reduce the risk posed by perpetrators of domestic abuse. The working group plans to hold a series of facilitated workshops to work through and agree recommended changes for how new arrangements should operate. Through these workshops, members will consider how to build in a person of concern focus in order to ensure that new arrangements will focus not only on reducing the risk to the victim, but also on reducing the risk from the person of concern. I'm confident this work will result in a robust multi-agency arrangement which will make material difference to the safety of high-risk victims of domestic abuse.
Mr. Donnelly.
Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for that answer. Could I ask the Minister if she is considering more immediate interventions for high-risk victims?
As part of the work that we're undertaking, we are exploring the potential to pilot arrangements for a daily risk assessment meeting, or a DRAM, which would operate in support of MARAC in the first instance, but would look at more immediate interventions for high-risk victims. We're also exploring how to pilot these arrangements within a single health and social care trust area, building on already established partnerships between Trust and PSNI. We hope to launch this pilot in January and run it until the end of the financial year 25-26, with an evaluation to follow.
Ciara Ferguson.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the Minister, or the Minister, in relation to MARAC, what consideration will be given to a child or children of victims of domestic abuse?
Well, I think it's important that when we look at those who are at risk, we consider the impact on children. And as you're aware, in the domestic abuse offences, there are aggravators, statutory aggravators there, which take account of children being aware, having had sight of or hearing domestic abuse taking place. So it is important that when we look, for example, at that person of concern, who is essentially the person who we are concerned about their violent behaviours, that person of concern will have links to other people, including children, as well as the main intimate partner who may be the subject of their domestic violence, and that will be taken into account.
Ross Bradley.
Mr. Speaker, question 6.
Mr.
Provision of stable accommodation for those on release from prison is a critical factor in ensuring desistance from reoffending and resettlement back into the community. Whilst responsibility for the allocation of housing sits solely with the Department for Communities and the Northern Ireland Housing Executive, the Northern Ireland Prison Service takes a proactive approach to preventing homelessness by ensuring that everyone coming into custody is assessed and those with accommodation needs are given appropriate support. A number of initiatives are in place with statutory and voluntary and community sector partners to mitigate against the risk of homelessness for those leaving prison. Despite these measures, 265 prisoners were released from a custodial sentence without a permanent forwarding home address between the 1st of November 2023 and the 31st of October 2024.
Mr. Bradley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answer. But Minister, can I ask you, what has your department had discussions around the enhanced pre-release housing assessments, strengthening partnerships between prisons, local councils and homelessness charities, or introducing a mandatory post-release housing plan? What regular audits and reviews of prisoner reintegration strategies has taken place thus far, considering the immense stress on housing throughout Northern Ireland at the present time?
Well, there are a number of initiatives that are in place to mitigate against the risk of homelessness, but to be clear, when somebody leaves prison, they leave the care of the prison system and the Department for Justice. And we cannot, for example, retain people within custody or deprive them of their liberty at the end of their sentence on the basis that they don't have anywhere to go. So prisoners will often not share the information with us. Many of the people we have said haven't given us a forwarding address. It's because they are not obliged to once they have discharged their sentence. It is widely acknowledged that there is a lack of suitable social and affordable housing, and this is felt acutely by those who are leaving prison. A protocol for the management of accommodation and related support needs of people in custody was published by the Housing Executive in December 2023 and sets out a collaborative approach to addressing accommodation needs from the Housing Executive, Housing Rights, Probation and Prison Service. Prison Services also put in place a number of initiatives to mitigate against the issue of homelessness for those leaving prison. They include an assessment of prisoner needs on committal, which includes their housing arrangements and enables staff to put in place interventions, for example, to prevent someone on a short sentence losing their tenancy. The introduction of housing advisors in Magabry provides early intervention on housing needs and allows decisions on accommodation to take cognizance of other resettlement factors, including health and employability. The use of approved premises to enable appropriate support and supervision arrangements to be put in place for high-risk offenders who are subject to public protection arrangements in Northern Ireland, and the introduction of a partnership project between Highbankwood College and Belfast City Council Complex Lives, looking at how better information sharing at committal and release could support those females most at risk of chronic homelessness. However, it is not an issue only for the Department of Justice or even primarily for the Department of Justice. We are willing to play our role in a collaborative effort with other departments to ensure that we do better by those who leave custody. We know that having a home is one of the main reasons why people desist from offending.
Linda Dillon.
And thank you to the Minister for the answers so far. Minister, you'll be well aware that many of those who are homeless on leaving prison, it is down to addiction and mental health issues. So what are you doing to ensure that those prisoners, when they are sentenced and in prison, are getting the assistance and help and intervention that they need around mental health and addiction? And can we be given reassurance that every sentenced prisoner with these issues is actually getting the intervention and help that they need?
Every prisoner who is committed to our care, whether on sentence or on remand, will be asked questions and can share information with us up to the point they wish to do so in terms of any historic issues with their mental health or with addiction. There are therapeutic services, but they're not provided by Prison Service. They're provided by the South Eastern Health and Social Care Trust, as is all of the health care for prisoners. But there are other interventions that are made within the prison setting in terms of trying to deal with addiction, deal with the trauma that often predates the addiction, and dealing with mental health issues and providing correct support. The key to this is to try and ensure that that through-the-door support continues and that there is continuity of provision in the community. And unfortunately, as many of you will recognise from working with your own constituents, it is the lack of community-based interventions around addiction and mental health that are often the stumbling block for people on release from prison, rather than the absence of those supports in the prison.
Stuart Dixon.
Thank you, Minister, for your answer so far. Minister, would you agree with me that your department and the Northern Ireland Prison Service have made a major contribution to assisting those leaving prison and with their housing by changing the day of release during the week? And also, would you agree with me that providing stable housing helps to stop reoffending?
Well, absolutely. If people have housing, if they have employment, if they have family support, then they are much less likely to offend in the first place and indeed to reoffend. So it's a huge part of the work that we do in terms of rehabilitation. In terms of bail and remand reviews, that is a decision that was taken by the Lady Chief Justice when we had discussions with her in respect of the vulnerability of people being released often on a Friday afternoon when mainstream services have ceased for the week and then are left to cope over the weekend without that support. And I think that that initiative that she has piloted by moving forward those reviews to earlier points in the week so that when people are released from custody they have access to those services is hugely beneficial, and at least gives people an opportunity when they're released into the community again to be able to make the best start possible.
Middleton.
Number 7, Mr. Speaker.
With your permission, I want to answer questions 7 and 12 together. I condemn all acts of violence that endanger the safety and well-being of women and girls. In recent times, we've seen an increase in reported violence, including attacks in the Derry and City and Strabane District Council area. My department is continuing to work collaboratively with other key departments to help eradicate violence against women and girls. This includes work under the Domestic and Sexual Abuse Strategy, which is led by my department and the Department of Health, and which builds on new offences and measures that I introduced in the last mandate to tackle domestic abuse, non-fatal strangulation and stalking, which are actively helping to keep women and girls safer. We know that women and girls are not exclusively affected by domestic and sexual abuse, but they are disproportionately so. And so the measures to address domestic and sexual abuse under the strategy will also directly contribute to broader goals of ending violence against women and girls. The delivery of the outcomes and objectives under the strategy is supported by a 3-year action plan, which sets out a range of specific actions that are intended to create a lasting change. For the 2024-25 financial year, a ring-fence budget of £1.62 million has been prioritised from the Department of Justice's core budget to support the delivery of cross-departmental work to tackle domestic and sexual abuse.
Speaker, and can I thank the Minister for her response. Minister, as the Minister for Justice, what measures are you taking to actually increase confidence for women and girls in the justice system and ensuring that they get proper access to support as well?
With respect to support for victims, most of that support is provided via other departments in collaboration with my own department. However, there are a range of cross-departmental priorities where we have allocated funding in terms of the Assist Advocacy Service, advocacy for the families of victims of domestic homicide, training for law enforcement and other frontline professionals, support for domestic homicide reviews, interventions such as Operation Encompass, the development of educational resources within CCEA Hub, all to support prevention of domestic and sexual abuse. There is also funding coming in this area from the Executive Office in order to fund the executive strategy for ending violence against women and girls. So from my perspective, in terms of building confidence, it is about ensuring that people get the service that they need at the time when they need it. And that means if they don't get the service they need at the time when they need it, then they know the routes to be able to make complaints about that. It is important that people are familiar with the victim and witnesses charters, that they understand their entitlements and their rights, and that they feel confident enough to exercise those even in a point of crisis.
Cara Hunter.
Thank the Minister for her answers so far. Understandably, women right across the North West are still feeling very unsafe. There's been a community response with self-defence classes in Limavady, which I think is brilliant. Can I ask the Minister, since these attacks just weeks previous, has she engaged with the local PCSP in Derry and the wider North West area?
Yes, we have, through the department, engaged with the PCSP in terms of additional funding and how they're spending the money that they have at the moment. It is something I'm aware, for example, that the PSNI have increased patrols. The PCSP also has, I think, some additional measures in place where people can, for example, get alarms from some of the PCSPs that they can carry with them for additional reassurance. So there are some challenges, and it is not an easy issue. Ultimately, my department mainly leads on the issue of policy. And there are no quick policy fixes to violence against women and girls. The operational side, in terms of the delivery of service, generally falls to those arm's-length bodies over which I don't have direct authority and control. But it is important to say that we have engaged both with the local community and with the PCSP and with the PSNI to ensure that they have the resources available to them to be able to do the work that they need to do in this context. And it is important to say that if people remain fearful, if people remain afraid, that is something that is to me unacceptable. We need to change the culture, both in this place and in other places where it is acceptable either to be aggressive towards women or violent towards women or abusive towards women. And until we get that right in this House as everywhere else, we will not see a sea change in terms of how women are treated on our streets.
Shielguy.
Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for her answers. Can I ask the Minister how she is targeting or focusing on perpetrators of abuse against women and girls?
There are a number of programmes that we have in terms of perpetrator programmes which allow us either through self-referral or through police referral to engage directly with us. So for some time now, the Department has been funding the Promoting Positive Relationships programme run by Probation Board for Northern Ireland, and that aims to provide men who are alleged to have been abusive within their intimate relationships and whose children have been assessed by social services at risk with an opportunity to engage in intervention involving the integrated group work programme. The purpose of that programme is to lead and develop knowledge and skills so that they can have healthy, non-abusive relationships. Also, as part of the new DSA strategy, the Department is undertaking work to look at costed options to enhance measures measures to address such behaviours. We've also had, for example, the White Ribbon campaign has come to Hydebank Wood and worked with our young men and young women there in order, again, to challenge attitudes. We have had a number of different partnerships, but I think it is important that we at all times recognise the power of peer intervention. And so what we focused on in Hydebank Wood was how young men would react if they saw other peers behaving in a way that they thought was unacceptable. And I think that that's something that we can all learn from when we see someone behaving in a way that is aggressive, that is unacceptable, that we are not afraid to speak out and to stand up for the person who may be fearful.
Thank you, Minister, for your answers so far. Can the Minister outline how many times her department has engaged with the Director of Public Prosecutions where sentences for violence against women and girls have been too lenient, and how many sentences this applies to? Thank
Minister.
you.
First of all, it would not be appropriate for me as Minister or for my department to engage directly with the Director of Public Prosecution or the Judiciary with respect to any specific sentence, because they are completely impartial and independent of the department, and it is right that they should be. However, the issue of sentence leniency is something that we do discuss, for example, at the Criminal Justice Board, in terms of the perception that that creates in the community and the fact that people often feel frustrated that having managed to get someone convicted for a serious offence, they then find that the sentence does not appear to match the crime. And that is a conversation we have. There are already powers for the Director of Public Prosecutions to appeal sentence against leniency. Those powers are slightly convoluted and complex, and so one of the things that I hope to do in one of my future bills in this mandate is to simplify and expand the list of sentences that can be appealed for leniency to make that process much easier.
Move to topical questions. Call Justin McNulty.
Minister, frighteningly, 103 murders here have been with the domestic abuse motivation between 2004 and 2021. And it's estimated that there's more than two-thirds of women and 50% of men who suffer domestic violence by a partner do not report it to police. What steps can you commit to, taken in conjunction with the Minister of Health and the Minister of Communities, to enhance the provision of refuges and to improve crisis intervention, support and recovery services, and also to enhance access to justice for people fleeing abusive and violent relationships?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that I share the member's concern about the rising number of domestic-related homicides in Northern Ireland. It's one of the reasons we have introduced domestic homicide reviews, and the learning from those, I believe, will be instructive in terms of ensuring that our partners who are responding to this at an operational level are able to do so better and to constantly refine and improve their performance in that regard in terms of protecting the public. It's also important to say, Mr. Speaker, that I came here today straight from an event on International Men's Day to acknowledge the number of male victims of domestic and sexual abuse who often struggle both through the stigma around admitting that they are victims of abuse, but also the difficulty of accessing services. And so one of the pieces of work that we're funding the Victims Commissioner to undertake is an assessment of the services that are available and an identification of the gaps in service so that we can better provide those services to the people who need them most. It is important to recognise that domestic and sexual abuse is no respecter of race, of gender, of age, of colour, of creed, and we need to recognise that there are many abuse victims who live with that pain and never disclose it to anyone. I want to thank the men who did disclose it in relation to the research that was produced, because it has been hugely helpful in terms of guiding what the Minister of Health and I will be able to take forward as a programme in response.
Mr McNulty.
Thank the Minister for her answer. Minister, the Criminal Justice Inspectorate has identified the fragmented approach across the justice system as a barrier to the access to justice. How will your department ensure better working relationships between organisations across the justice system to ensure a unified approach that keeps victims' needs central and ensures that the system supports and protects them?
Well, one of the things that I have done is to ensure that the Victims of Crime Commissioner designate can attend the Criminal Justice Board meetings that we hold on a quarterly basis, so that as we discuss the changes that we wish to make to the justice system in terms of improving access, in terms of speeding up justice, in terms of new protocols, that we have victims at the heart of what we do, that they are not a periphery issue, but that they are at the heart of what we do. Relationships within the various justice organisations, I think, are less of an issue than perhaps some of the barriers that we face through discontinuity in terms of our IT systems and some of the kind of practical measures that are in place. There is also an independence issue where there is a limit to what the department can do other than encourage and incentivise that cooperation. But I have to say that I find those who sit around the board table at the Criminal Justice Board to be fully committed to trying to ensure that they make the journey for victims as seamless as possible. But where that does not happen, again, I would ask people, if someone comes to you and makes a complaint and feels that they have been ill-served by the justice system, make them familiar with the Victims and Witnesses Charter, and where you feel that they have been let down, make a complaint.
Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Minister, for her answer so far. And on the same issue, the report that was brought out this morning, which I think was a very important report to shine light on some of the issues that are going on. There has been the focus on violence against women and girls, rightly, given that they face these issues disproportionately. But can I ask, some of the third sector organisations in that field have been key to trying to give support to women. Could I ask the Minister what engagement she's had with similar organisations that support men to help support them through domestic violence cases?
Minister.
We have quite good engagement through our domestic and sexual abuse expert panel with organisations that support both male and female victims of violence. We also, through a number of other opportunities that we have, obviously engage with them throughout the year. The Men's Advocacy Project, for example, is a really good example of an organisation that speaks up for and supports men who find themselves in this particular situation. One of the issues that has arisen as a result of the research, and I think it's hugely important, is that it has shone a light on just how few men actually report this. So although 31% of victims last year were male, we know that there was only around 50% of them had reported it, and sadly, less than that still who were willing to make a report to the police and the authorities in order to pursue justice. I understand the frustrations that people have. Justice can be daunting and it can be complex, but it is important, because until we hold those who are responsible to account, we will not see a sea change in terms of attitudes and culture.
Well, David Brooks.
Thank you, Minister. Could I ask, we understand that from the report that some of those issues around the lack of refuge and also access to family may be barriers to men coming forward. I understand that's not all within your remit, but do you plan to have conversations with other ministers to see how men can be supported across the executive?
Minister.
It's not just something I plan to do, it's something that I have been doing. I mean, I recently at a constituency level wrote to the Minister for Communities regarding the fact that if you are the non-resident parent, even if you have equal custody, shared custody, you're only entitled to one additional room in your house by dispensation. If you have 3 children, all of different sexes, where are they all supposed to go in that one room? And so it denies men the right to be able to take up their shared custody arrangements as they ought to be. And so there are real issues in terms of our processes and procedures that need to be more nuanced, because the issue, of course, for the housing executive is that they're saying, well, you can't double count the same people twice. Well, unfortunately, in blended households and in separated households, you need to, if you're going to be able to maintain relationships. Those are issues that we are trying to work our way through. They are not easy to resolve, but they are important that they're resolved. And it's also important to say that my own department will be introducing a small grant scheme hopefully in the next few weeks. And I would encourage organisations that work in this particular space to come forward and make application, because whether it is to do studies around the prevalence of this, whether it is to provide frontline support to people, I think it is something that we would certainly be very open to funding.
Michelle Guy. Michelle Guy.
Apologies. Can I ask the Minister to outline the current population of Northern Ireland's prisons?
On the 1st of November 2021, the Northern Ireland prison population was 1,559. On the 1st of November 2024, it was 1,925, an increase of 24%. Whilst the population position has not become precarious as quickly as we had expected, it remains highly challenging and very finely balanced. Pressures continue to be felt most acutely in Maghaberry Prison, where over 450 prisoners are sharing a cell on a daily basis.
Mrs. Guy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How are these numbers affecting resourcing pressures within the prison service?
Well, my focus and the priority of the Director-General is to ensure Prison Service has the resources it needs to ensure that it can focus on its key priorities. That is keeping people in custody safe and secure, and that includes those who work in that environment, and supporting individuals in their rehabilitation and resettlement post-prison. That's why I gave approval for officer numbers across the Prison Service to increase by 75. Earlier this month, Prison Service launched a new recruitment campaign with the intention of employing more than 100 new prison officers. It is important that our prisons are properly resourced, because without the ability to do those interventions, to do the education, to do the challenge on offending behaviour, we will release people back into the community who have not been rehabilitated and have not changed their attitudes or behaviours, and that will lead to more victims. This investment is a wise investment, and it's one that I think we need to make.
Robinson.
Can I ask the Minister when she expects to receive an update on any progress that has been made for a 240 cell accommodation block and control room at McGilligan Prison?
The member will be aware that we have had to split what was originally a one-size business case, which included both that and the kitchen block, and we have had to split the business case into two. So we're now advancing the business case for the smaller accommodation block and the kitchen, and then we will be looking at the larger accommodation block. Those are at outline stage at this point, but all of this is contingent on us receiving the resources that are required to ensure that we can replace the facilities at McGilligan. Those of you who are familiar with the prison at McGilligan will be aware that, somewhat like Trigger's broom, I think there is more now holding it together than there is of the original substance of the buildings.
Mr. Robinson.
Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the Minister for her answer, and I do agree. Does she recognise and accept that the ageing and decaying of this prison has been ongoing for many years, and it's important that there is investment into this facility which will provide long-term employment for hundreds of people whilst ensuring a reduction in reoffending among the prison population?
Absolutely, and I think one of the key things when I visit McGilligan is that I recognise that what happens within McGilligan is not reflected in the estate in which it takes place. There is some excellent work, really important work happening through Prison Service in terms of rehabilitation, in terms of care for elderly prisoners, and in terms of support for families that I think is not well served by the current estate. We're absolutely committed to maintaining our site in McGilligan. It is an essential part of the estate, and I am absolutely convinced that we need to invest significant money on that estate in order to ensure that we have a prison that is fit for purpose and that is fit for the future. And that is something that, with my colleagues in the Executive, I will be seeking additional resource, because without it we will not be able to progress.
Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for answers so far. Has the Police Ombudsman returned to work, and if not, has the Minister had any conversations with the office about when we can expect this change?
The Police Ombudsman has not returned to work at this point. The Department has ongoing conversations with the Ombudsman's office to ensure that they have the requisite authorities to be able to continue with their work. We have no indication at this point in time as to a date of return for the Ombudsman.
Finally.
Just in terms of that then, has the Minister had any contact with the Ombudsman about the release of the Kingsmill report?
Minister.
With respect to the release of reports, the authority is already there for the Chief Executive and the Chief Investigator. They have already received the delegated authority which would allow them to release those reports. So the absence of the Ombudsman is not a barrier to the release of those reports.
All right, Harvey.
Mr. Speaker, and could the Minister provide an update on our Department's discussions with the NI Bar Law Society
Minister.
in relation to legal aid payments, both in terms of delays on payment and payment increases? Thank you.
Sir.
With respect to my engagement with the Law Society and the Bar Council, those are ongoing. I will be meeting the Bar of Northern Ireland tomorrow. I met with the Law Society last week. As you know, I intend, Mr Speaker, to bring a statement to this House in which I will set out my response not only to the Burgess review, but also to wider issues across the legal aid landscape. So not only criminal, but also family and civil legal aid. And I think it's important that I engage with the sector around that. With respect to payments, we have been able, through easements within the department, to allocate additional resource to the legal aid budget, which means that as of today, we are about £1 million shy of the maximum spend last year of £114 million, which is, I have to say, the highest spend in any part of these islands.
Mr Harwick.
Okay, Minister, I was going to ask you, would you maybe consider reallocating some of the £13 million earmarked for the new prison cafe at McGilligan to help address the issue, but you're obviously already addressing it. Thank you.
Mr Speaker, I do find it slightly ironic that one member of the DUP is here asking me to spend more in McGilligan while another is here asking me to spend less. The simple answer to your question is no, I wouldn't consider it, because first of all, it is capital investment for McGilligan, and that money is being invested in a very necessary development so we can feed our population, so that we can train them in hospitality, and I believe it is essential. But also, what we lack in terms of legal aid are two things: a sustainable model and revenue funding. So it wouldn't be appropriate for me to move capital to revenue.
Nick Matheson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can the Minister provide an assessment of the effectiveness of domestic homicide reviews?
Your challenge is to do that in 30 seconds, Minister.
Well, I think they provide us with an opportunity for organisations to reflect on policy and procedure and determine if they can be amended or improved. I think they're vital in terms of how we keep people at risk from domestic abuse safer. To date, 4 executive summaries have been published. Some of the recommendations from those have already been implemented, and work to implement the remaining are still underway.
Well done, thank you. And that draws to a conclusion questions to the Minister for Justice. If members would take their ease, and we